Deshaun Ellis sat in his corner office, a spacious glass-walled room overlooking the city skyline. His gaze, however, wasn't on the view. He was scrolling through a stream of negative reviews on his tablet, his expression growing darker with each line he read. Once a thriving business, his car repair chain, Ellis Auto Services, was showing cracks. Customers were complaining about long wait times, shoddy work, and rude service. The once solid reputation of his brand was slipping, and despite numerous strategy meetings, no one could explain why. Today was supposed to be the day his senior staff presented solutions. Deshaun's COO and longtime friend, Malcolm, had rallied the managers to find out what was going wrong at the ground level. But as the team gathered around the boardroom table, their explanations sounded like a pile of excuses. "It's the economy, Deshaun," one of them said. "People are tightening their budgets." Another chimed in, "Our competitors are offering cheaper prices. People go for what's cheap over what's quality." A third added, "It could just be a seasonal slump. We're bound to bounce back." Deshaun listened, his jaw tight. None of these answers felt right. This wasn't a seasonal slump or a minor economic shift. Customers were frustrated, loyal clients were leaving, and employees were quitting in droves. There was something deeper at play, something no one here seemed to understand. After the meeting, Malcolm lingered behind. He was one of the few people Deshaun trusted implicitly, someone who had been with him since the company's early days. "Deshaun, if you want my honest opinion, you're not going to get the answers from up here," Malcolm said, nodding toward the office floor below. "I think it's time to get a closer look, see what's happening down there." Deshaun sighed, running a hand over his beard. He knew Malcolm was right. "You're saying I should go undercover?" he asked, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It wouldn't be the first time a CEO did it. And look, you know as well as I do that people don't act the same around you when they know who you are. You might find something the rest of us are missing." After a moment, Deshaun nodded. "All right, let's do it." The next day, Deshaun was no longer the polished, sharply dressed CEO. Instead, he was David Turner, a new mechanic hired to work in the most problematic branch of his chain. His beard was trimmed to a scruffy length, and he wore a worn-out baseball cap and plain work clothes that would help him blend in with the other employees. With a quick briefing from Malcolm and a forged employment record, he was ready to start. Deshaun arrived at the branch early, parking his old pickup truck in the lot and heading inside. The building looked run-down compared to the others he owned. The walls were dingy, the floors scuffed, and the reception area had a stack of unorganized papers spilling over the counter. He made his way to the garage, where he was introduced to Frank, the branch manager. Frank was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern look. His handshake was firm, but his expression was anything but friendly. "David, huh?" Frank said, looking him up and down. "Let's hope you're not another one of those quitters. We don't need any more dead weight around here." Deshaun resisted the urge to respond. Instead, he nodded, adopting a humble posture. "Just here to work hard, boss," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Good," Frank grunted, already walking away. "You'll be working with Lewis and Kenny today. They'll show you the ropes. And remember, we don't tolerate slackers here." Deshaun followed him into the garage, where he saw the employees bustling around. Some of them looked at him with mild curiosity before returning to their tasks. He was introduced to Luis, a young mechanic with a warm smile and an easygoing demeanor, and Kenny, an older, gruff man who barely acknowledged him. Luis showed him around, explaining the workflow and pointing out where things were kept. They chatted as they worked, and Deshaun quickly learned that Luis had been with the company for about 3 years. He enjoyed the work but wasn't shy about expressing his frustrations. "It's not easy working under Frank," Luis said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "He's strict, you know? Always breathing down your neck, and he doesn't care if you're struggling. If you're not working fast enough, you're out." Deshaun frowned, feeling a pang of frustration on Luis's behalf. "Does anyone ever try to talk to him about it?" he asked, genuinely curious. Luis chuckled, shaking his head. "Are you kidding? Frank doesn't care what we think. If you try to bring anything up, he shuts you down, says it's not his problem." He paused, lowering his voice. "Plus, he's got a way of keeping people in line. You don't want to get on his bad side." As the day went on, Deshaun began to notice the dynamics in the garage. Frank was a constant presence, hovering around with an intimidating air, often making snide comments about the mechanic's speed and quality of work. He was quick to criticize and slow to offer praise. Deshaun also caught on to Frank's habit of picking on certain employees, particularly those who were younger, less experienced, or from minority backgrounds. In the afternoon, Deshaun overheard Frank speaking to a customer at the reception desk. The customer was complaining about a repair that had been done poorly, and Frank's response was dismissive, almost rude. He blamed the customer for not understanding cars and suggested that they had probably caused the damage themselves. The customer left looking more frustrated than when they'd come in. Later, while he and Louis were working on a car, Deshawn couldn't help but bring it up. "Does Frank always talk to customers like that?" Louis nodded grimly. "Pretty much. I try to be polite when I'm out front, but Frank, he thinks people are here to be scammed, not served. It's like he doesn't care if they come back." That was a red flag. Deshawn felt a tightening in his chest as he realized how deep the issue might run. If this was how Frank treated customers and employees alike, it was no wonder the branch was losing business. By the end of his first day, Deshawn was exhausted. It wasn't just the physical labor. He was no stranger to hard work, but the emotional toll of seeing his own business in such a sorry state. As he clocked out, he watched Frank berate another employee over a minor mistake, belittling him in front of everyone. It was a humiliating display, and it left a sour taste in Deshawn's mouth. That night, Deshawn lay awake, replaying the events of the day in his mind. It was clear that Frank's attitude was having a toxic effect on the entire team. Employees were demoralized, customers were disrespected, and the atmosphere in the shop was suffocating. He realized that he was dealing with more than just poor management. This was a deeply ingrained culture problem. Determined to get a fuller picture, Deshawn returned the next day with a renewed sense of purpose. He focused on observing the smaller details, the nervous glances employees cast toward Frank, the way they tensed up whenever he walked by, and the whispered complaints he overheard during lunch breaks. On the third day, Deshawn noticed something strange. He caught Frank slipping a few extra charges onto a customer's bill, charges that hadn't been mentioned during the repair process. When Deshawn brought it up to Louis later, the young mechanic shook his head knowingly. "It's called padding the bill," Louis explained in a hushed tone. "Frank does it all the time. Adds extra stuff to the bill, things the customer didn't ask for. Most people don't even notice." Deshawn felt a surge of anger. It was one thing to be strict with employees, but this was outright theft. If Frank had been doing this consistently, it meant he'd been scamming customers for who knew how long, and it was Deshawn's reputation on the line. By the end of the week, Deshawn had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. Frank was not only a bully but a crook. He was running his branch like a fiefdom, squeezing money out of unsuspecting customers while keeping his employees under his thumb with fear and intimidation. But there was something else, something deeper that troubled Deshawn. He'd heard a few comments from Frank and others that hinted at a sense of resentment toward the higher-ups in the company, including Deshawn himself. Some employees felt abandoned, like they were just cogs in a machine run by someone who didn't care about them or their struggles. That realization stung. Deshawn had always prided himself on building a company that respected and valued its employees. Yet here he was, witnessing the exact opposite. He knew that if he wanted to fix things, it would take more than just firing Frank. He would have to rebuild trust with his employees, and that would mean making some hard decisions about the future of Ellis Auto Services. As Deshawn ended his undercover shift, he couldn't help but feel a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. He had entered this mission hoping to solve a business problem, but he was beginning to realize that it was much more personal than he had anticipated. There was no quick fix for the damage done here, only a path forward, one he would have to walk carefully. And as he left the branch that day, Deshawn knew exactly where to start. Deshawn returned to the branch the following Monday with a quiet resolve, ready to dig even deeper into the culture that had poisoned his company from within. Each day he focused on blending in, picking up on details, and getting closer to the employees. He knew his mission was more complicated than simply catching Frank in the act. He needed to understand the atmosphere that had made such corruption possible in the first place. Over the next few days, Deshawn formed a genuine camaraderie with Louis, who had started to see him as a mentor of sorts. Their conversations grew more honest, with Louis opening up about the branch's struggles and the bleak outlook for many of the younger mechanics. Louis admitted he dreamed of moving up within the company, maybe even managing his own branch one day, but under Frank's leadership it felt impossible. "There's no room to grow here, man," Louis confided one afternoon as they replaced a car's transmission. "It's like you do your work, keep your head down, and hope you don't get noticed by Frank. He'll only chew you out if he thinks you're trying to outshine him." Deshawn listened, feeling a pang of guilt. This was exactly the type of culture he had worked so hard to avoid, a place where employees were afraid to stand out or innovate. He had started Ellis Auto Services to create opportunities for people like Louis, people with skill and ambition. Yet here he was, seeing firsthand how his own manager was stifling the potential he had set out to nurture. His frustration only grew as he saw Frank's behavior escalate. Frank's disdain for Deshawn, disguised as David, was palpable. It seemed that Frank saw him as a threat, or maybe just another scapegoat for his own failings. He often assigned Deshaun the dirtiest jobs, deliberately giving him tasks designed to break his spirit. The more Deshaun persevered, the more Frank's hostility seemed to intensify. One day, as they were working late on a particularly grueling job, Frank cornered Deshaun near the back of the shop. "You think you're some kind of hot shot, huh?" Frank sneered. "I've seen guys like you before. Think you can just walk in here, do a little hard work, and show the rest of us up?" "Well, let me tell you something, David, there's a reason I'm the one calling the shots around here." Deshaun met Frank's gaze steadily, resisting the urge to break his cover. Instead, he forced a slight shrug. "Just trying to do my job, man." Frank snorted. "Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable. I don't need any more competition around here." He spat the word competition with a venom that startled Deshaun. It was as if Frank had been at the center of his own twisted game, where every employee was an enemy, a threat to his control. The interaction left Deshaun with a bitter taste in his mouth. It was no wonder that morale was so low, with employees being treated as adversaries rather than team members. He started to wonder how Frank had managed to remain in a managerial position for so long. It was then that he began to suspect that perhaps others higher up in the company had chosen to ignore Frank's behavior, or worse, didn't know it was happening at all. That evening, after everyone had clocked out, Deshaun decided to do a little digging. He found a quiet corner in the break room and used his phone to search through the company's financial records and employee feedback reports, all of which he could access as the CEO. What he found shocked him. Frank's branch had the highest rate of complaints and the lowest retention rate in the company. Numerous reports from employees had been filed, but it seemed that most of them had been ignored or resolved with vague comments from HR. Deshaun felt a surge of anger, realizing that the bureaucratic indifference in his own company had allowed Frank to operate unchecked. Determined to understand the full extent of the corruption, Deshaun pressed on. The next day, he arrived early, ready to observe Frank's operations with a sharper eye. That morning, a young customer came in with an issue that was relatively simple to fix. However, Deshaun noticed Frank inflating the problem, claiming the customer needed an extensive set of repairs. The customer, trusting Frank's expertise, reluctantly agreed. Deshaun felt his hands clench into fists as he watched the interaction. Frank was not just skimming off the top, he was outright scamming people, preying on their lack of automotive knowledge to line his own pockets. Over the following days, Deshaun noticed other employees quietly enabling Frank's schemes. They would turn a blind eye, occasionally even pitching in to cover up the extra charges. One of them was Kenny, the older mechanic who rarely spoke to Deshaun. When Deshaun caught Kenny adding unnecessary parts to an invoice, he decided it was time to have a quiet conversation with him. "Kenny, can I ask you something?" Deshaun began carefully one afternoon as they were working side by side. Kenny barely looked up. "What's that?" "You ever think about, I don't know, why we're charging customers for things they don't need?" Deshaun kept his tone light, trying not to raise suspicion. Kenny snorted, finally glancing up at him. "Listen, kid, you want to last here, you do what you're told and don't ask questions. Frank's the boss. You cross him, you're out of a job, simple as that." Deshaun tried to push a little further. "But doesn't it bother you, charging people like that?" Kenny gave him a hard look, his face set in a weary expression. "What bothers me is putting food on the table. Look, I don't like it either, but I'm too old to be out looking for another job. Frank takes care of the people who keep their heads down. Best advice I can give you." It was clear that Frank ruled through fear and loyalty bought with under-the-table favors. He'd managed to create a network of enablers, each one complicit, knowingly or not, in his scam. Deshaun realized that if he wanted to clean up this mess, he couldn't just go after Frank, he would have to dismantle the entire structure Frank had built around himself. As the days passed, Deshaun began to see how deeply Frank's influence had taken root. He had convinced his employees that the only way to survive was to play along with his schemes, to protect him if they wanted to keep their jobs. It was a toxic system, and it would take more than a simple revelation to break it. But Deshaun's real breakthrough came one evening after hours, when he stayed late to finish up some paperwork. As he walked through the empty shop, he heard voices in the back office. Curiosity got the better of him, and he crept closer, listening through the cracked door. Frank was talking to someone over the phone, his voice low but urgent. "Look, I don't care what it takes. If corporate starts sniffing around, I need this stuff cleaned up. Tell them whatever they want to hear. Just keep them off my back." Deshaun felt a chill. It seemed Frank had more than just the local employees involved in his schemes. He might even have connections in the corporate structure who were either ignorant of his activities or actively covering for him. Either way, it was clear that Frank's influence stretched further than Deshawn had initially thought. As he made his way home that night, Deshawn's mind was racing. He now understood the full scope of what he was up against. It wasn't just a matter of one crooked manager. It was a culture of corruption and fear that had taken root in his company, and he was the only one who could uproot it. But he also knew that confronting Frank too early could be a disaster. If he didn't play his cards right, Frank might find a way to cover his tracks, leaving Deshawn with nothing but rumors and suspicions. He needed concrete evidence, proof that could expose not only Frank but the network he had built within the company. That night, Deshawn resolved to stay undercover a little longer. He would gather every scrap of evidence he needed, build a case that couldn't be ignored, and when the time was right, he would make his move. The next phase of his mission was clear. He would confront Frank and dismantle his empire from within. Deshawn returned to work the next day with his mind set on gathering the evidence he needed to take Frank down. After days of listening, observing and experiencing the branch's toxic culture firsthand, he felt he was close to having enough. But he also knew he had to move carefully. Frank was sharp and had built a network of enablers and allies. If he sensed Deshawn's true intentions, he'd likely find a way to wriggle out of any accusations. As David, Deshawn had established enough of a reputation as a diligent worker to blend in. Most employees saw him as a decent guy just trying to keep his head down, which allowed him to move around more freely without drawing too much attention. That day, he decided to focus on one of the biggest pieces of Frank's operation, the padded bills. Deshawn noticed that certain customers, usually those who appeared unfamiliar with car repairs, would receive bills with inflated charges. Frank would add unnecessary parts or even bill for services that hadn't been performed. Deshawn realized if he could document a few of these instances, he'd have solid proof of the fraud. That morning, a middle-aged woman came into the shop, looking nervous as she handed her car keys to Frank. "It's just making a strange noise," she explained, "and I thought I should bring it in before it gets worse." "Don't worry," Frank replied smoothly, his voice dripping with false reassurance. "We'll take a good look and make sure everything's in top shape." As she left, Deshawn caught Frank giving him a look. "David, go take a look at that car," Frank said, tossing him the keys. "And don't waste time if it needs work. Just write it up." Deshawn nodded, hiding his anger. He brought the car into the garage and did a thorough inspection. The noise turned out to be nothing more than a loose belt, an easy fix that wouldn't take more than a few minutes. He tightened it, ensuring everything was safe and secure, then walked over to Frank to report back. "It's just a loose belt," Deshawn said. "I fixed it already. Should be good to go." Frank gave him a sharp look. "Good to go? That car's probably got more issues than she's aware of. Customers don't know what to look for, David. If we don't tell her what's wrong, who will?" Deshawn kept his face neutral. "Well, I checked everything else. It's in good shape." Frank's jaw tightened, and Deshawn could see the wheels turning. After a moment, Frank sighed and gestured to Kenny, who was working nearby. "Kenny, write up a full inspection. List out some recommendations, new brake pads, maybe a suspension check. We'll add it to the bill." Deshawn's fists clenched. It was one thing to add minor repairs, but Frank was going to bill the woman for services she didn't need. And worse, he was pulling Kenny into it. Kenny gave Deshawn an apologetic look, but he didn't argue. He scribbled down a list of charges as Frank instructed, adding nearly $400 in unnecessary services. Deshawn knew he couldn't let this go. He needed evidence, something undeniable. As the customer came to pay, he watched from a distance as she reluctantly handed over her credit card, looking uncertain but trusting Frank's expert advice. Once she left, Deshawn made a mental note to access the billing system later and print a copy of her inflated bill. Over the next few days, Deshawn continued gathering similar evidence. He noticed that Frank often targeted customers who seemed unfamiliar with car repairs, especially women and elderly clients. Each time, he would use the same method, adding unneeded parts and labor to inflate the bill. Deshawn managed to print several copies of these fraudulent bills, each one showing the same pattern of deceit. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Deshawn stayed late. He accessed the shop's records, making copies of dozens of inflated invoices and expense reports. The paper trail was damning. Frank had been overcharging customers for months, if not years. Deshawn felt a grim satisfaction as he filed the evidence away. He was almost ready to confront Frank. But there was one more piece of the puzzle he needed to address: the employees who had been forced to go along with Frank's schemes. Some, like Kenny, participated reluctantly, while others, such as Frank's assistant manager, seemed more complicit. Deshawn knew he had to get them on record, acknowledging Frank's influence over them. Without their voices, it might look like he was targeting Frank alone. The next morning, Deshawn arrived early and approached Luis, who had become his closest confidant. He pulled Luis aside in the break room and lowered his voice. "Luis, I need to talk to you about Frank." Luis looked wary. "What about him? Has he ever asked you to do something that didn't feel right? Like padding a bill or adding unnecessary work?" Luis glanced around, then sighed. "Yeah, all the time. If you want to keep your job here, you have to follow his rules. Frank's the boss. He doesn't care if what he's doing is shady, and if you cross him, he'll make sure you're out on the street." Deshawn nodded. "Why haven't you reported him?" Luis laughed bitterly. "To who? HR. They don't care about what's going on here. And even if they did, I'm just a mechanic. Frank's got friends in high places. Nothing I say would make a difference." Deshawn felt his heart sink. The fear Frank had instilled was pervasive, keeping good people silent. But he sensed that Luis wanted to talk, to share his frustration. "What if you weren't the only one speaking up?" he asked carefully. "What if there were others?" Luis hesitated, as if weighing his options, then nodded slowly. "I'd consider it if I knew I wouldn't be alone." Deshawn placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm working on it, man. Just trust me a little longer." Over the next few days, Deshawn had similar conversations with other employees. Each one revealed more about the culture of fear and manipulation Frank had created. They shared stories of being forced to participate in dishonest practices, threatened with termination if they didn't comply. Deshawn made a mental note of each conversation, confident that he now had enough testimonials to support his case. By the end of the week, Deshawn was ready. He had a stack of fraudulent invoices, employee testimonials, and even a few recorded conversations where Frank openly discussed his schemes. He knew it was time to confront Frank, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed witnesses, people who would see the truth of what was happening, and who could back him up when he brought his findings to corporate. That Friday afternoon, Deshawn gathered the employees in the break room, announcing that he had something important to share. He saw the curiosity and anxiety in their eyes as they settled in, glancing nervously at each other. Frank, unaware of what was about to unfold, strolled in and leaned against the wall with an amused smirk. Deshawn took a deep breath, then began. "I know some of you have been dealing with things here that don't feel right, things you've been forced to go along with, even though you know they're wrong." A murmur rippled through the room, and Frank's face darkened. Deshawn continued, his voice steady. "I've been watching, listening, and I have proof that some of you have been forced into unethical practices that have been hurting both our customers and our team." Frank's smirk vanished, replaced by a glare. "What are you talking about, David?" he sneered. "You think you know something about how I run this place?" Deshawn met his gaze with calm resolve. "I know more than you think, Frank." With that, he reached up and removed his worn baseball cap, standing tall and meeting each employee's eyes. "My name isn't David," he said. "I'm Deshawn Ellis, CEO of Ellis Auto Services." The room fell silent, shock spreading across the faces of the employees. Frank's mouth opened, then closed, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Deshawn held up the stack of invoices and paperwork. "I have evidence that Frank has been padding bills, scamming customers, and manipulating all of you into helping him. He's been using fear to keep everyone in line, threatening jobs and livelihoods to protect his schemes." Frank sputtered, his face flushing red. "This is ridiculous. You're not even here half the time. How would you know what goes on in this branch?" Deshawn stepped closer, his voice dropping to a steely tone. "Because I've been working here, right beside everyone else, and I've seen enough to know you've been exploiting good people to cover for your own corruption." Frank's confidence wavered, but he quickly recovered, sneering as he crossed his arms. "All right. Let's say you're right. What are you going to do? Fire me? You think you're doing these people a favor, but once I'm gone, none of them will last a month here without me. This branch will collapse." Deshawn didn't flinch. "I don't think that's true, Frank. In fact, I think the only thing holding these people back is you." Turning to the employees, he addressed them directly. "I want to rebuild this branch with people who actually care about their work and respect each other. If you're willing to help me make that happen, I'm here to support you." The employees exchanged looks, and slowly, one by one, they began to nod. The weight of their silent support filled the room, and Deshawn felt a surge of pride and determination. As Deshawn stood before his employees, the weight of what he had just revealed settled over the room. The stunned silence was quickly replaced by a mix of shocked murmurs and darting glances between the mechanics. Frank's face had gone a deep shade of red, and Deshaun could see his jaw clenching as he glared back, realizing his control was slipping. Deshaun continued, addressing the employees. This isn't about just keeping a job anymore. It's about creating a place we can all be proud of, a place where the work we do means something to each of us and to our customers. Just as he was finishing, Frank stepped forward, his fists clenched. This is ridiculous. He snapped, his voice laced with anger and desperation. You think you're some kind of hero coming in here and pretending to know what's going on. You have no idea what it takes to run this place, day in and day out. Deshaun held his ground, meeting Frank's glare with a steady gaze. I do know, Frank. I've seen exactly what you've been doing, firsthand. I know the way you've been treating these people, how you've forced them to be complicit in your schemes, and the damage you've done to our reputation with customers. And it ends now. Frank laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You think you can waltz in here and just replace me? These people need me. Without me, they'd fall apart. He shot a look around the room, daring any of the employees to challenge him. Who's going to run this place when I'm gone? You? He scoffed, his eyes flashing with disdain. Good luck. But as he looked around, he didn't find the support he'd once counted on. The employees, once too afraid to speak up, were now watching him with guarded, uncertain expressions. A few, like Luis, had their jaws set in determination, standing close to Deshaun in silent solidarity. You're wrong, Frank, Deshaun said quietly. They don't need you. In fact, I think they'll do better without you. Frank's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Deshaun could see a flicker of fear beneath the bravado. Frank looked around the room again, as though realizing that the power he once held over these people had evaporated, but he wasn't about to go down quietly. Fine, Frank spat, straightening his posture and forcing a smirk onto his face. If you want me gone, I'll leave. But don't think this is over, Deshaun. You've made a mistake crossing me. With that, he turned and stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The employees seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, and Deshaun could see the tension slowly draining from their faces. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in their expressions. Now, Deshaun said, addressing them, I know this is a lot to take in. I know things have been rough, and I'm not going to pretend that everything will change overnight, but I want each of you to know that I'm here to make things right. He looked around, catching each person's gaze. If any of you want to stay and help me rebuild this place, I'd be honored to have you on board. If you're willing to work hard and give this branch a fresh start, I promise that I'll be here to support you every step of the way. Luis was the first to step forward, his eyes bright with determination. I'm in, he said firmly, glancing at the others. I've been waiting for this for a long time. Kenny hesitated, then nodded, his expression softening. I'm tired of all the lies. I want to work somewhere I can feel proud of. One by one, the other mechanics voiced their agreement, some more hesitant than others, but all showing a willingness to give Deshaun a chance. They were ready for a change, even if it meant stepping out of the shadow of fear Frank had cast over them for so long. Over the next few days, Deshaun wasted no time putting his plans into action. His first priority was addressing the inflated bills and restoring trust with the customers who had been wronged. He personally reached out to several customers, apologizing for the overcharges and offering refunds or complimentary services. Most of them were surprised by the gesture, but Deshaun knew that regaining their trust was essential to rebuilding the branch reputation. He also introduced a new system for transparency and billing. Every repair and replacement would now come with a detailed breakdown, and each mechanic was instructed to walk customers through the charges before any work was done. Luis took charge of training the team on how to communicate clearly and honestly with customers, ensuring they understood the importance of treating every client with respect. With Frank gone, the atmosphere in the shop began to shift. The employees were tentative at first, unsure if they could trust this new direction. But as Deshaun continued to work alongside them, they started to open up. Deshaun encouraged an open-door policy, where any employee could come to him with concerns or ideas without fear of retaliation. Slowly, the team began to find their footing, realizing that they could finally voice their thoughts without fear of punishment. Luis, who had shown great leadership potential, began stepping up even more, helping to organize the workflow and ensure that everyone stayed on task. He had always been ambitious, and now, under Deshaun's guidance, he saw an opportunity to take on a larger role. Deshaun noticed this and decided to officially promote Luis to assistant manager, a decision that brought a new sense of purpose to both Luis and the rest of the team. One afternoon, as they worked on a particularly busy day, Deshaun noticed that the employees seemed more at ease than he'd ever seen them. They were laughing, exchanging stories, and even helping each other with repairs. The oppressive cloud that had once hung over the shop was lifting, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie and pride in their work. But not everything was smooth sailing. Deshawn soon realized that Frank's influence had left deep scars. There were moments of tension and mistrust, and some employees struggled with the transition. They had been conditioned to fear leadership, to see it as something punitive rather than supportive. And letting go of that mindset took time. One day, Kenny approached Deshawn in the break room, his expression guarded. "Listen, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I'm not sure I can do this. I've been here a long time, and it's hard to shake off everything that's happened." Deshawn nodded, understanding the weight of what Kenny was saying. "I get it, Kenny. Frank made things tough, and it's not easy to change overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here for you, and I believe in you. You've got the skills and experience, and I think you're a valuable part of this team." Kenny looked away, his expression softening slightly. "Thanks, Deshawn. I'll try. Just give me a little time." Deshawn patted him on the shoulder. "Take all the time you need. We're in this together." As the days turned into weeks, the shop began to regain its reputation in the community. Customers who had once been wary started returning, drawn by the honesty and integrity that had become the branch's new foundation. Deshawn's direct involvement didn't go unnoticed, either. Word spread that the CEO himself had been working in the trenches, leading by example, and this gesture resonated with both employees and customers alike. One morning, Deshawn walked into the shop to find the crew gathered around Luis, who was holding a small plaque. They had taken it upon themselves to create a Customer Care Excellence Award, a simple wooden plaque they had pooled their money to buy. Luis grinned as he handed it to Deshawn, "For the man who showed us what leadership really means." Deshawn felt a lump form in his throat as he accepted the plaque. It wasn't about the wood or the inscription, it was the symbol of what they had all accomplished together. He looked around at the faces of his team, the same people who had once worked under Frank's oppressive rule, now united by a shared sense of purpose. "Thank you," Deshawn said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Every single one of you made this happen." As the employees cheered, Deshawn felt a renewed sense of pride. This branch had become more than just a part of his business, it was a testament to resilience, to the power of community and integrity. It was everything he had dreamed Ellis Auto Services could be. But Deshawn knew there was still work to be done. Other branches needed attention, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. As he looked at Luis, he saw a leader in the making, someone who could continue the mission he had started. After the cheers died down, Deshawn took Luis aside. "I think you're ready for more responsibility," he said, smiling. "How would you feel about running this branch?" Luis's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely. You've proven yourself, and I trust you. This place is in good hands with you." Luis nodded, a look of pride and determination on his face. "I won't let you down." As Deshawn walked out of the shop that day, he felt a sense of closure. The branch was in good hands, the employees had found their voice, and the toxic culture that had once threatened everything he built was finally gone. After promoting Luis to branch manager, Deshawn felt confident that the worst of his struggle with this location was over. However, as he began his transition out, a new series of challenges emerged. With Frank gone, certain financial discrepancies had started to come to light, issues that seemed to stretch beyond the branch and hinted at possible deeper problems within Ellis Auto Services. Deshawn hadn't anticipated these complications, and he knew he had to address them head-on if he wanted his company to thrive. Deshawn spent the next few days back in his office, combing through financial reports, invoices, and personnel files. The more he dug, the more he realized that Frank hadn't been working alone. Some of the shady financial practices extended to other branches, all tied to a network of managers who had been following Frank's lead. They'd likely believed that no one at the executive level would scrutinize the numbers closely enough to notice. One name that kept surfacing was Mark, a regional supervisor who had once been a colleague of Frank's. Mark managed multiple branches, and while his performance reports were clean on the surface, Deshawn could see a pattern of inflated sales numbers and a similar approach to overcharging customers, just like Frank had done. It was clear that Mark had been part of the same system of corruption. Deshawn felt a mixture of frustration and disappointment. He had built Ellis Auto Services on values of honesty and integrity, but now he realized that somewhere along the line, the organization had allowed itself to stray. While Frank was gone, the rot in the company hadn't been entirely excised. Mark and possibly others were continuing the practices that had tainted the brand and taken advantage of both customers and employees. Determined to root out the rest of the corruption, Deshawn decided to confront Mark directly. He set up a meeting, scheduling it at a neutral location, a coffee shop away from corporate and any branch office. When Deshaun arrived, Mark was already there, seated in a corner booth, his demeanor calm but guarded. "Mark," Deshaun greeted as he sat down, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for meeting me on short notice." Mark nodded, his face impassive. "Of course, what's this about?" Deshaun didn't waste time. "I've been looking into some of the practices that have been happening at various branches. Overcharging, falsified records, inflated numbers." He leaned in, his gaze steady. "And your name keeps coming up." For a split second, Mark's face registered surprise, but he quickly masked it with a nonchalant shrug. "I don't know what you're talking about, Deshaun. If there were any discrepancies, I'm sure it's just a miscommunication." "A miscommunication?" Deshaun's voice was hard. "I have the numbers, Mark. I can see what's been going on. This isn't just a mistake or an oversight. It's a pattern, one that mirrors what Frank was doing. And you were close to Frank, weren't you?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, but he forced a smirk. "I worked with Frank, yes. But that doesn't mean I had anything to do with whatever he was doing. You can't blame me for something you think he might have been involved in." Deshaun leaned back, observing Mark carefully. "I can and I will, if I find evidence. But right now I'm giving you a chance. I want you to come clean, to tell me what's been going on. If you do, I might consider a way for you to stay with the company. But if I find out you're lying to me, you're done." Mark stared at Deshaun for a long moment, weighing his options. Deshaun could almost see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating whether it was worth coming clean, or if he should try to deny everything. Finally, Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "All right," he said, his tone subdued. "Yes, I knew about what Frank was doing. He'd figured out a system, a way to keep sales numbers high and increase his commission. He taught a few of us how to do it, said it was just creative accounting. I didn't think it was hurting anyone." "He didn't think it was hurting anyone." Deshaun's voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding into his tone. "It hurt our customers, it hurt our employees, and it hurt our reputation. You know, I built this company to be a place people could trust, a place that cared about its community." Mark looked away, unable to meet Deshaun's gaze. "Look, it was wrong. I get that now. But it's not like I was the only one. A few of us, Frank, me, and others, we were just trying to make ends meet. It's hard to stay afloat in this industry, Deshaun. You know that." Deshaun took a deep breath, trying to rein in his anger. He had built this company with an idealistic vision, one that now seemed painfully naive. But he also knew he had to fix this problem without letting anger cloud his judgment. "You're right about one thing, it's not just you. And that's why I'm not going to let this continue." Mark looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "So, what now?" "You're going to help me identify everyone involved," Deshaun said firmly. "Every branch, every manager. I want to know how deep this goes. If you cooperate, we'll find a way to handle this internally, but it's going to involve changes. Big ones." Mark nodded slowly, relief spreading across his face. "I'll do it, Deshaun. I'll give you everything I know." Over the next few weeks, Deshaun worked closely with Mark to uncover the full extent of the network Frank had built. They discovered that while some managers had followed Frank's methods out of greed, others had simply been pressured into it, afraid of losing their jobs if they didn't comply. Deshaun reached out to these individuals, offering them a chance to come forward and reform their practices in exchange for their cooperation. One by one, managers came forward, confessing their involvement and expressing a willingness to change. Deshaun held meetings with each of them, emphasizing the values he wanted Ellis Auto Services to stand for: honesty, integrity, and respect. He made it clear that anyone who chose to continue with unethical practices would be terminated without hesitation. His transparency and fairness struck a chord with many of the managers, who had long felt trapped under the toxic influence Frank had spread. To ensure lasting change, Deshaun implemented a new system of accountability. He established regular audits for each branch, surprise inspections, and a reporting system that allowed employees to anonymously raise concerns. He also set up a hotline for customers to report any suspicious billing, ensuring that they had a direct line to corporate if they felt they were being treated unfairly. But Deshaun didn't stop there. He knew that the true heart of his business was in the people who worked there every day, and he wanted to empower them. He launched a training program focused on ethical business practices, customer service, and team collaboration. Each manager, including Luis, would participate in these workshops with the goal of fostering a company-wide culture of integrity. The changes began to take root, and Deshaun could see the difference almost immediately. Employees at every level started to feel a renewed sense of purpose. no longer just punching a clock but contributing to a company that valued their integrity and hard work. Customers noticed too. Word spread that Ellis Auto Services had made a real effort to clean up its act, and people began returning to the branches, appreciating the honesty and transparency that had become the brand's hallmark. One afternoon, Luis called Deshawn from the branch he was now managing. "Deshawn, I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice brimming with gratitude. They're different now. The team feels like a family again. I can't tell you how much this means to us." Deshawn smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm glad to hear that, Luis. This wouldn't have been possible without you and everyone else stepping up. You all made this happen." As he hung up, Deshawn allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had nearly lost his company to the rot that had grown unchecked, nearly let his dreams be tarnished by the actions of a few corrupt individuals. But now Ellis Auto Services was stronger than ever, a testament to resilience and the power of change. Over time, Deshawn watched as the company continued to flourish. He had proven to himself and to his team that no matter how deep a problem might run, it could be solved with commitment, honesty, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth. He felt a renewed sense of pride, knowing that he had managed to steer his company back on course, and more importantly, had created a legacy of integrity that would endure. Ellis Auto Services had become more than just a business. It was a place where people could count on honesty, trust, and respect. And for Deshawn, that was worth every struggle he had faced along the way. Months passed, and Deshawn could see the fruits of his labor flourishing across Ellis Auto Services. The transformation wasn't just visible in the financial reports, which showed increased customer retention and improved profit margins, but in the faces of the employees, the loyalty of returning customers, and the sense of pride that had permeated each branch. Deshawn knew that while the initial storm had been difficult to weather, the changes he had implemented had finally set his company on the right course. One Friday afternoon, Deshawn decided to pay a surprise visit to Luis's branch, the one that had been the epicenter of Frank's mismanagement and the testing ground for Deshawn's new policies. When he walked through the doors, he was greeted by a warm, bustling atmosphere. The mechanics were working efficiently, joking with each other, and engaging warmly with customers. The receptionist, who had once seemed nervous and disconnected, now greeted everyone who entered with a genuine smile. As Deshawn made his way through the shop, he spotted Luis in the middle of a repair job, his sleeves rolled up and a smudge of grease across his forehead. Seeing Deshawn, Luis's face lit up, and he quickly wrapped up what he was doing to greet him. "Hey, boss," Luis said with a grin, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't expect to see you here today." "Just thought I'd drop by," Deshawn replied, returning the smile. "Wanted to see how things are going. And by the looks of it, you're all doing great." Luis nodded, pride evident in his expression. "It's been a complete turnaround, Deshawn. I mean, it was tough at first getting everyone on board, earning the customers' trust back. But we've got a real team now. People actually want to be here." Deshawn looked around, watching the teamwork with a smooth rhythm that came from genuine collaboration and respect. "You've done a fantastic job, Luis. I couldn't have picked a better person to lead this branch." Luis's eyes shone with appreciation. "Thanks, Deshawn. That means a lot coming from you. Honestly, you gave us the tools and the trust to make this place something special." They spent the next hour touring the branch, with Luis proudly showing Deshawn the new systems he had put in place to keep everything running smoothly. There were clearly defined roles, a checklist for every vehicle that went through the shop, and a clear chain of command that allowed everyone to know where they stood. Deshawn could see that Luis had taken the initiative, building on the framework he'd provided and putting his own spin on things. As they finished the tour, Deshawn found himself in the break room, which had been redecorated with posters and reminders about the company's values. There was even a suggestion box by the door, with a sign that read, "Your voice matters." Deshawn smiled, realizing that his original vision for Ellis Auto Services was finally coming to life. But just as he was feeling the weight of satisfaction, Luis glanced at the suggestion box and cleared his throat. "Actually, there's something we wanted to talk to you about, Deshawn." Deshawn raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Luis hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Well, a few of us have been talking. The changes you've made here have been amazing, but we were wondering if you'd consider making us partners in this." Deshawn's expression softened with surprise. "Partners?" Luis nodded, his gaze steady. "Not just employees. We want to be more involved in the business, take on more responsibility, share in its success. If we're partners, we have a real stake in making sure things stay on track, not just because we work here, but because we're invested in the future of the company." Deshawn felt a surge of pride and excitement. He'd always wanted his company to feel like a family, a place where people weren't just cogs in a machine but essential parts of something greater. Louis's suggestion was exactly the kind of thinking he had hoped to inspire. "You know, Louis," Deshawn began slowly, "that's a bold idea. And I like it. I think it's exactly what this company needs to keep growing, to ensure the integrity we've worked so hard to build stays intact." Louis's face broke into a broad smile. "Really? You'd consider it?" Deshawn nodded. "Yes, we'll have to figure out the details, of course, how to structure it, how to make it fair for everyone who wants to be involved. But I believe in rewarding commitment, and I can't think of a better way to ensure Ellis Auto Services remains a place of integrity than by making the people who care about it the most true partners." As news of the new partnership structure spread, enthusiasm rippled through the company. Employees were thrilled at the prospect of becoming part owners, knowing they'd have a stake in both the risks and rewards of the company's success. It was a radical shift, but one that brought Deshawn immense satisfaction. He could see that the loyalty, dedication, and transparency he valued so deeply were becoming cornerstones of the business. In the months that followed, Deshawn worked closely with a team of financial advisors and legal experts to set up a partnership program. They created a system that allowed employees to earn shares based on tenure, performance, and contribution to the company's values. The program was designed to reward not only hard work but also ethical practices, ensuring that everyone who was invested in the business shared a commitment to honesty and respect. The change reinvigorated Ellis Auto Services. Employee turnover plummeted as workers felt more committed to their roles, knowing their contributions were directly tied to the company's growth. Customers, too, noticed the difference. Many commented on how welcoming and dedicated the staff seemed, and word spread quickly that Ellis Auto Services was now a company owned by its people. One day, Deshawn received a letter in the mail. It was from a former customer who had visited one of the branches during Frank's management and had been overcharged for repairs. The customer, who had initially sworn off the company, wrote to commend the changes Deshawn had made, mentioning that they had heard of the new partnership structure and were considering returning as a customer. They praised Deshawn for his leadership, noting that his willingness to go undercover to fix the company's problems had inspired them to give Ellis Auto Services another chance. Deshawn sat at his desk, reading the letter with a sense of quiet pride. He had faced unexpected challenges, seen parts of his company he hadn't wanted to see, and confronted the uncomfortable reality that his business had lost its way. But through it all, he had stayed true to his mission, and now Ellis Auto Services was stronger for it. Reflecting on the journey, Deshawn realized that his decision to go undercover had been the turning point. Without that first-hand experience, he might never have seen the depth of the issues plaguing his business, nor would he have understood the power of listening to those on the front lines. By walking in his employees' shoes, he had learned invaluable lessons about leadership, accountability, and trust. As Ellis Auto Services continued to grow, Deshawn remained deeply involved in the company's operations. He visited branches regularly, not just as a CEO but as a friend and mentor to his employees. The culture he had helped to cultivate was now self-sustaining, with employees taking pride in their work and holding each other accountable to the values that defined the company. In time, Ellis Auto Services expanded beyond its original markets, opening new branches in neighboring cities. Each new location carried with it the same principles of integrity and respect, and each new hire was trained not only in technical skills but in the company's code of ethics. Deshawn's journey from CEO to undercover mechanic had changed the course of his life. He was no longer just a business owner, he was a leader, who had proven that no problem was too deep to fix, that no system was too broken to repair, and that true success came from the strength of the people who built it. And so, Ellis Auto Services thrived, becoming a beacon of ethical business in the community. Customers trusted them, employees respected them, and the legacy Deshawn had built became a model for others in the industry to follow. What had started as a simple car repair business had become a testament to resilience, integrity, and the enduring power of doing things the right way.